Why do we talk the way we do? And when things get serious, truly life or death, how does our language change? During the Second World War, millions of people were thrown into situations they could never have imagined. They needed new words. They needed a shorthand for their new reality. This wasn't about being clever. It was about survival. It was about coping. The slang they created wasn't just a collection of funny terms. It was a code. It was a shield. It was a way to say what couldn't be said directly. These words tell a story of boredom, fear, dark humor, and a strange kind of hope. They reveal more about the daily life of a soldier than many official reports ever could. What does it mean when an entire generation starts using the same secret language? And what happens to those words when the war is over? Number 22, what do you call it when everything is hopelessly confused? They called it SNAFU. This might be the most famous piece of slang to come out of the war. It's an acronym. The polite version is situation normal all fouled up. Soldiers, of course, used a much stronger F word. The genius of SNAFU is in the first two words, situation normal. It implies that chaos wasn't the exception. It was the rule. It was the everyday state of being. This wasn't just a complaint, it was a philosophy. It was a deeply cynical and darkly humorous way of looking at the world. The term seems to have first appeared in military circles around 1941. The U.S. Army was expanding at an incredible rate. It grew from under 200,000 soldiers in 1939 to over 8 million by 1945. This rapid growth created massive logistical nightmares. Paperwork got lost, orders were contradictory, supplies went to the wrong place. For the average soldier, the GI, this bureaucracy was a constant, frustrating presence. SNAFU was the perfect word to describe it. It captured the feeling that the entire system was a mess, but a mess that everyone had to live with. His linguist Jonathan Leiter, in his Historical Dictionary of American Slang, traces the term's first printed appearance to the September 1941 issue of American Notes and Queries. By 1942, it was everywhere. It even became the name of a cartoon character, Private SNAFU. The Private SNAFU cartoons were training films created by the U.S. War Department. So they were directed by Chuck Jones of Looney Tunes fame, and the stories were often written by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. The character of SNAFU did everything wrong. He talked when he should have been quiet. He didn't clean his equipment. He fell for enemy tricks. Each cartoon was a lesson in what not to do, but the name itself was a nod to the soldiers. It told them, we get it. We know things are a mess. It was a piece of official propaganda that embraced the unofficial language of the troops. The power of SNAFU was that it created a shared understanding. When one soldier said it to another, it was a shorthand for a whole range of frustrations. It was a way of saying, this is absurd, you know it, I know it, but we'll get through it. It built a sense of camaraderie. It was the language of the enlisted men, the ones on the receiving end of the confusing orders. It separated the people who actually did the work from the distant, unseen eye who made the plans. This wasn't just about military life. The term was so useful that it seeped into civilian language after the war and is still used today. It describes a feeling that is universal, the sense that you are a small part of a large, chaotic system that you cannot control. But what if the term did more than just help soldiers cope? What if it actually shaped their perception of reality? The constant use of a word that normalizes chaos might have made it easier to accept dangerous or inefficient situations. It was a joke, but it was a joke with a serious edge. How many critical mistakes were excused with a shrug and the word SNAFU? If we could listen back to the private conversations of commanders and planners, how often did they use this term to dismiss a problem that should have been solved? And does the very existence of a word like SNAFU suggest that large-scale human endeavors will always be, at their core, hopelessly and permanently messed up? Number 21. What do you call a problem that's beyond fixing? If SNAFU was a mess, FUBAR was a catastrophe. This was the next level. SNAFU meant things were messed up, but it was business as usual. FUBAR meant the situation was completely destroyed. It was beyond repair. The acronym stands for Fouled Up Beyond All Recognition. Or, again, a more forceful F word was typically used. This was the term you used when the plan had not just failed, but had disintegrated into something unrecognizable. Here, FUBAR emerged a bit later in the war than SNAFU, likely around 1943 or 1944. It represents a deepening of the cynical humor that characterized soldier slang. As the war dragged on, the situations soldiers faced became more intense and the failures more consequential. A simple SNAFU might not have been strong enough to capture the sheer level of disaster they sometimes witnessed. FUBAR was a term of ultimate resignation. It was the verbal equivalent of throwing your hands up in the air. The creation of FUBAR shows how slang evolves in high-stress environments. Language has to keep up with experience. As the reality on the ground becomes more extreme, the words used to describe it have to become more extreme as well. The difference between fouled up and fouled up beyond all recognition is immense. One is an annoyance, the other is a total wreck. The historian and author Paul Fussell wrote extensively about the language of war in his 1975 book, The Great War and Modern Memory. While his focus was the First World War, his insights apply here. He argued that the realities of industrial warfare were so brutal and absurd that they required a new, more ironic and understated language. FUBAR is a perfect example of this. It takes a horrifying situation and reduces it to a single, almost clinical-sounding acronym. This process of turning a complex disaster into a neat little word is a powerful psychological tool. It helps to distance the speaker from the trauma of the event. Instead of having to describe the specifics of a failed operation or a piece of equipment that had been completely destroyed, a soldier could just say, "It's FUBAR." This communicated the entire meaning without having to relive the details. It was efficient and emotionally protective. It was also a term that was exclusively for the initiated. If you knew what FUBAR meant, you were part of the group. You understood the reality. The term spread rapidly through the American military. It was a useful and descriptive word. After the war, it, like SNAFU, entered the civilian vocabulary. It found a home in engineering, in business, in any field where complex systems can fail in spectacular ways. The 1998 film Saving Private Ryan famously used the term, introducing it to a new generation. Captain Miller, played by Tom Hanks, looks at a hopeless situation and mutters, "This whole mission is a FUBAR." The line perfectly captures the sense of a good soldier trapped in a disastrous plan. But does a term like FUBAR make it easier to accept failure? By giving a name to total, unfixable disaster, do we become more accepting of its possibility? How many soldiers use the word to describe a situation they might have otherwise tried to salvage, simply because the label suggested it was beyond hope? And what does it say about the human mind that our first instinct when faced with complete and utter chaos is not to scream, but to invent a clever acronym? Number 20. How does a car become a legend? It was small, it was tough, and it could go almost anywhere. Soldiers called it the Jeep. But where did that name come from? The story of the word Jeep is a story about American ingenuity and the strange way names can stick. The vehicle itself was a marvel. In 1940, the U.S. Army knew it needed a new, lightweight, all-terrain reconnaissance vehicle. They put out a call to automakers with a ridiculously short deadline, 49 days, to produce a working prototype. Only one small company, American Bantam, managed to do it, but the Army worried Bantam was too small to produce the numbers they needed. So they gave the plans to two larger companies, Willys Overland and Ford. The vehicle that resulted was officially designated the General Purpose Vehicle, or GP for short. And this is where the story of the name begins. One theory, the most popular one, is that soldiers simply slurred the letters GP together and it came out sounding like Jeep. It's simple, it makes sense, and it's probably true. But there's another more fun theory. At the time, there was a popular character in the Popeye comic strip called Eugene the Jeep. This creature was small, could move between dimensions, and could solve impossible problems. For soldiers encountering this amazing little vehicle that could climb hills and cross rivers that seemed impassable, calling it a Jeep after this magical character made a certain kind of sense. The name started to appear in print in early 1941. R. Lee Ermey, the famous drill instructor and military historian, often told the story of how the Willys Overland test driver, Irving "Red" Houseman, demonstrated the vehicle's abilities by driving it up the steps of the U.S. Capitol. When a reporter asked him what he called it, he supposedly said, "It's a Jeep." Whether that story is true or not, the name caught on like wildfire. It was short, it was catchy, and it perfectly suited the vehicle's plucky, can-do character. The Jeep became one of the most iconic symbols of the war effort. More than 640,000 of them were built. They served in every theater of the war. They were used as scout cars, ambulances, command vehicles, and even light gun platforms. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, called the Jeep one of the three tools that won the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane and the landing craft. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent so much time with the common soldiers, wrote lovingly about the Jeep. He said it was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. The word Jeep became synonymous with the vehicle. Willys Overland trademarked the name after the war and began producing civilian versions. The name had become so powerful that it was more valuable than the original GP designation. This is a classic example of folk etymology, the process by which a word's origin is popularly assumed but is not historically accurate, possibly eclipsing the true origin. In this case, both the GP and Eugene the Jeep stories have their supporters, and the truth might be a combination of both. But what does the adoption of a nickname like this tell us? It shows a deep affection. Soldiers don't give affectionate nicknames to equipment they hate. The word Jeep is a testament to the vehicle's reliability and usefulness. It was a piece of equipment that soldiers trusted. Did the playful name Jeep help soldiers personify their vehicles, making them feel more like partners in the struggle rather than just machines? If the vehicle had been saddled with a clunky official name, would it have earned the same legendary status? And how many soldiers' lives were saved because this small, unassuming vehicle with its funny little name could get them out of a tight spot when nothing else could? Number 19, who do you blame when the machine mysteriously breaks? You blame the gremlins. These were mischievous little imps who lived inside machinery and caused it to fail at the worst possible moments. If a plane's engine sputtered for no reason, it was gremlins. If a radio suddenly went dead, gremlins. If a weapon jammed, it was the work of these invisible troublemakers. The idea of gremlins wasn't just a joke, it was a vital coping mechanism, especially for air crews. The concept of gremlins seems to have originated with pilots in the British Royal Air Force RAF in the 1920s. They were spoken of at bases in the Middle East and on the northwest frontier of India. The pilots were flying early, often unreliable aircraft in extreme conditions. When things went wrong for no apparent reason, it was easier and more comforting to blame a mythical creature than to accept that their plane was simply faulty or that they had made a mistake. The name itself might be a mix of the word goblin and Fremlins, the name of a local beer that was popular with RAF pilots. The idea really took off during the Second World War. The stress on pilots and air crews was immense. They were operating complex machines at the very edge of their performance limits, often in terrible weather and under enemy fire. The technology was still relatively new, and mechanical failures were common. Blaming gremlins provided a way to release tension and deal with the constant fear of something going wrong. It was a shared superstition that bonded the crews together. They would talk about gremlin rules, like not messing with the oxygen supply, but loving to drink fuel. The idea was popularized by the author Roald Dahl. Before he wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Dahl was an RAF pilot. He flew fighter planes in North Africa and Greece. In 1942, after being injured in a crash, he was sent to Washington, D.C. as an assistant air attaché. It was there that he wrote his first children's book, The Gremlins. The book told the story of these little creatures who sabotaged British aircraft. Dahl's story was that the gremlins were doing it because their forest home had been destroyed to build a factory. The hero of the story, a pilot named Gus, convinces the gremlins to stop their mischief and instead help the war effort. The story was shown to Walt Disney, who loved it and planned to make an animated film. The film was never completed, but Disney published the book in 1943, and the idea of gremlins entered the popular imagination. The term became so widespread that mechanics and engineers had to take it seriously, in a way. If a pilot reported a problem and a mechanic couldn't find a physical cause, they might just write gremlins in the logbook. It was a shorthand for unexplained mechanical issue. This shows how a piece of folklore can become integrated into official or semi-official procedures. The U.S. military even produced posters warning airmen about gremlins, using them as a way to remind crews to be vigilant and double-check their equipment. The gremlin myth served a vital psychological purpose. In a world governed by the cold, hard laws of physics and engineering, the idea of a gremlin introduced an element of fantasy. It allowed airmen to personify the random, unpredictable nature of mechanical failure. It's less terrifying to think you're fighting a mischievous little creature than to believe you're at the mercy of a random metal fatigue fracture. But did this belief in gremlins ever lead to carelessness? Could a pilot or mechanic dismiss a serious recurring problem by simply blaming it on a mythical creature instead of investigating it more thoroughly? How many near disasters were laughed off as gremlin trouble when they were actually signs of a fundamental design flaw? And do we still have modern-day gremlins, invisible forces we blame when our complex technology, from our cars to our computers, fails us for no apparent reason? Number 18. What was that buzzing sound in the sky? It was a doodlebug. This was the nickname British civilians and Allied soldiers gave to the V-1 flying bomb. This weapon was a new and terrifying thing. It was an unpiloted jet-powered bomb, a precursor to the modern cruise missile. The German regime began launching them against London and other targets in southeastern England in June 1944, just a week after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The V-1 was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The name Doodlebug is a perfect example of how language can be used to belittle something terrifying. A doodlebug is a real insect, the larva of the antlion. It's a small, strange-looking creature that digs a pit in the sand to trap ants. Calling a fearsome new weapon a doodlebug was a way of cutting it down to size. It was a classic case of British stiff upper lip humor. Another nickname for the V-1 was Buzz Bomb. This was more descriptive. The V-1's pulse jet engine made a distinctive, sputtering roar that sounded like a giant, angry insect. The sound of the V-1 became infamous. People on the ground would hear its buzzing approach. The most terrifying part was when the buzzing stopped. The engine would cut out when the bomb reached its preset range, and it would then glide silently to the ground and detonate. That sudden silence was the moment of maximum fear. You knew it was coming down, but you didn't know where. Over a period of 80 days, more than 9,500 V-1s were launched against England. The struggle against the doodlebugs was a major military effort. The anti-aircraft gunners, known as Hack gunners, developed new techniques to shoot them down. The Royal Observer Corps, a group of civilian volunteers, provided crucial early warnings. Allied fighter pilots would even try to intercept them. One dangerous tactic was to fly alongside the V-1 and use the wingtip of their own plane to flip the V-1's wing, disrupting its gyroscope and sending it crashing into an unpopulated area. This was incredibly risky. A study of the V-1 campaign by the British government after the war showed the immense resources dedicated to stopping them. The defense effort, codenamed Operation Crossbow, involved thousands of personnel and aircraft. The slang terms doodlebug and buzz bomb were adopted by everyone, from soldiers and pilots to civilians cowering in air raid shelters. The names appeared in newspapers and on the radio. They helped to create a shared experience. Everyone knew what you meant when you talked about the doodlebugs. Using a nickname made the threat feel more manageable. It was a way of domesticating the terror. Instead of an anonymous, high-tech weapon, it became a pest, something to be swatted. The use of these nicknames highlights a common human response to fear. We give frightening things silly or familiar names to rob them of their power. It's a psychological defense mechanism. The names were a small act of defiance. They sent a message: you can send your new weapons, but we will not be broken. We will even make fun of them. But what is the long-term effect of giving a weapon a cute name? Does it mask the true horror of its effects? Did the term doodlebug make it easier for people to talk about a weapon that caused immense suffering and destruction? And in doing so, did it slightly sanitize the reality of war? And how many people, hearing that strange buzzing sound in the sky for the first time, felt a moment of confusion before the terror set in, all because of a simple, silly nickname? Number 17, how do you say goodbye in a letter? You hope you never get a Dear John letter. This was the dreaded letter a soldier received from his wife or girlfriend back home, telling him that their relationship was over. It was a devastating blow, a personal crisis delivered by mail into the middle of a global one. The name itself is a masterpiece of cold, impersonal dismissal. It doesn't say Dear Michael or Dearest Robert, it just says Dear John. John was a generic name, a stand-in for any soldier. The letter was a form letter for heartbreak. The exact origin of the term is hard to pin down, but it became widespread among American soldiers during the war. Before this, such a letter was sometimes called a gate or a heel, but Dear John was the phrase that stuck. The U.S. was a nation on the move. Millions of men were sent overseas, away from their homes and loved ones for years at a time. The long separation put immense strain on relationships. Mail was the only link to home, and it was a lifeline. A letter could bring joy and a sense of connection, or it could bring the worst news imaginable. The phenomenon was so common that it became a part of military culture. There were jokes about it, songs about it, cartoons about it. This was a way of coping, of sharing the pain, and making it feel less personal. The Dear John letter was often a subject of study by military sociologists. A 1949 study by the researchers Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, Men Under Stress, looked at the psychological pressures on air crews and noted the profound impact of these letters on morale and performance. A soldier who had just been billeted was considered a risk to himself and his unit. He was distracted, depressed, and might take unnecessary chances. Officers were often trained to watch for the signs and to try to support a soldier who had received such a letter. The structure of a Dear John letter became almost legendary. It would often start with a few vague pleasantries, then drop the bombshell, I've met someone else. It would then often end with a hollow, I hope we can still be friends. The formula was so well known that soldiers could often tell what was coming after the first few lines. The phrase, Dear John, became a warning sign. The term reflects a major social change that was happening during the war. With so many men away, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They gained a new level of economic and social independence. This was a liberating change, but it also meant that some women felt less bound to wait for a man who might not come back, or who would come back a changed person. The Dear John letter, in a way, was a symptom of these shifting social dynamics. The phrase has lasted long after the war. It's now a common idiom in American English for any letter or message that ends a romantic relationship. It has become a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for a specific kind of pain, but how many of these letters were written not out of a lack of love, but out of desperation and loneliness? Can we ever truly understand the pressure on the women at home who were also living through a time of immense stress and uncertainty? And what about the letters that were never sent, the ones that were written and then torn up because the thought of causing that much pain to someone so far away was just too much to bear? Number 16, who was the man that was everywhere? His name was Kilroy, and he was here. You would find the message scrawled on walls, on crates, on ships, on captured enemy equipment in dusty barracks in North Africa, and on newly built airstrips in the Pacific. The graffiti was simple, a drawing of a little man with a big nose and bald head peeking over a wall with the words Kilroy was here written next to him. It was the great mystery and the ultimate inside joke of the war. Who's Kilroy? Nobody knew for sure, and that was part of the magic. The graffiti seemed to appear in the most impossible places. Soldiers would land on a remote island and find the message already there. They would open a sealed crate of supplies and find Kilroy peeking out. It created a myth that Kilroy was some kind of super GI, a phantom who could go anywhere and do anything, always arriving before anyone else. And the most likely origin story centers on a man named James J. Kilroy. He was a rivet inspector at the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts during the war. His job was to check the work of the riveters. To show the foreman that he had inspected a section, he would write, Kilroy was here in yellow crayon on the ship's hull. The ships were built in sections, and his mark would often end up in sealed, inaccessible parts of the vessel. When the ships were sent to war zones, soldiers and sailors would find his signature in these strange, hidden places. The legend grew from there. In 1946, the American Transit Association ran a contest to find the real Kilroy, and James J. Kilroy came forward with proof. He was awarded a full-size streetcar as a prize. The little drawing of the man peeking over the wall seems to have a separate origin. It was a popular bit of British graffiti known as Mr. Chad. Chad was often drawn with the words, "What? No tea," or "What? No cigarettes," written underneath, a commentary on the frequent shortages. At some point, probably through contact between British and American troops, the American phrase "Kilroy was here" merged with the British drawing of Mr. Chad. The combination was irresistible. The Kilroy phenomenon was more than just a doodle. It was a symbol of the American presence around the globe. It was a way for soldiers to leave their mark, to say, "I was here in a world where the individual often felt anonymous and insignificant." It was a quiet act of rebellion, a bit of unofficial art in a highly regulated military environment. It connected millions of soldiers who would never meet. A soldier in Italy could draw a Kilroy and know that a soldier in the Philippines would understand its meaning. It was a sign of a shared identity. The sociologist Leroy Beach wrote about the psychology of graffiti in his work, arguing that it's a way for people to assert their existence in an impersonal environment. Kilroy was here is the purest expression of this. It's not a political statement or a protest. It's a simple declaration of being. The writer is saying, "In this vast and chaotic war, I exist. I made it to this place. The legend of Kilroy became so pervasive that it was said that high-ranking officials were both amused and baffled by it. Stories, likely apocryphal, were told of Stalin seeing it in a VIP bathroom at the Potsdam Conference and asking his aides who this Kilroy was. It became a global meme before the word meme even existed. But what if James J. Kilroy wasn't the only one? Could there have been multiple Kilroys all leaving their mark, whose stories have been lost to history? How many times did a soldier, feeling alone and far from home, find comfort in seeing that familiar doodle and knowing that another American had been there before him? And does the enduring mystery of Kilroy prove that a good story is sometimes more important than the literal truth? Number 15, what do you call the other guy? You might call him Jerry. This is the common slang term used by British and Commonwealth soldiers and later by Americans to refer to a German soldier. You know, it wasn't a term filled with hatred. In fact, it was almost familiar. It was a way of personalizing the enemy, of turning him from a faceless monster into a person with a common name. The origin of Jerry is thought to come from the shape of the German steel helmet, the Stahlhelm, which was introduced in 1916. To British soldiers, its shape resembled a chamber pot, which was sometimes colloquially known as a jerry. Another theory suggests it's simply a diminutive of German. Whatever its origin, the name stuck. It was used in conversation, in letters home, in newspaper reports. A soldier might say, "We saw a few Jerrys over on that ridge," or "Jerry was shelling us all night." The use of a nickname like Jerry is a complex psychological phenomenon. On one hand, it's a way of othering the enemy. It lumps them all together under one label. On the other hand, it humanizes them. Jerry is a much less aggressive and dehumanizing term than many other wartime slurs. It lacks the venom of racial or ethnic epithets. It sounds like you're talking about a neighbor, not a mortal enemy. This reflects the strange duality of a soldier's experience. They had to fight and defeat the enemy, but they also recognized that the men on the other side were just soldiers like them, caught in the same war. The military historian John Keegan, in his book The Face of Battle, describes the experience of combat from the soldier's point of view. And he emphasizes the moments of shared humanity that can occur even between enemies. The use of a relatively mild nickname like Jerry fits into this picture. It allowed soldiers to maintain a psychological distance without completely stripping the enemy of his humanity. The term was used for the soldiers, not for their government or ideology. Soldiers made a distinction. Jerry was the guy in the trench opposite you. This was different from the language used by propaganda posters or political leaders, which was often much harsher. The slang of the soldiers on the ground was often more pragmatic and less ideological. Another common term for German soldiers was Kraut, which was more prevalent among American GIs. This term derived from sauerkraut, the food stereotypically associated with Germany. Kraut was generally considered more pejorative and insulting than Jerry. The choice of which word to use might have reflected a different attitude or a different national perspective. The use of these nicknames was a way to manage the difficult psychological task of fighting. To fight effectively, a soldier has to objectify the enemy to some degree. But to remain sane, he often needs to retain some sense of their shared humanity. Nicknames like Jerry existed in that gray area in between. But did this use of a familiar nickname ever lead to a moment's hesitation in combat? Did a soldier ever see a Jerry and feel a flicker of kinship that made his job harder? And how did the German soldiers feel about these nicknames? Did they even know about them? And if so, did they see them as an insult or as a strange, backhanded sign of respect? Number 14, who is the average soldier? He is G.I. Joe. The term DI became the all-encompassing name for the American soldier in the Second World War. It's another acronym, and its origin lies in the mundane world of military logistics. The letters stand for Government Issue or General Issue. This stamp was put on everything the Army gave to a soldier, from his rifle and his boots to his socks and his K-rations. Well, everything was GI soldiers started to joke that since the government owned all their equipment, it owned them too. They were just another piece of government issue, so they started calling themselves G. The term started to gain traction in the late 1930s and became universal during the war. It was a term of cynical pride. It acknowledged that they were part of a massive impersonal machine, but it also became a badge of honor. To be a GI was to be one of the millions of ordinary men who were doing an extraordinary job. The term was used by the soldiers themselves, by the press, and by the public. It captured the essence of the citizen soldier, the regular guy who had been drafted or had volunteered to serve. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle was instrumental in popularizing the term and the image of the GI. He lived with the troops, slept in the same foxholes, and ate the same rations. His columns were not about grand strategy or famous generals. They were about the daily lives of the enlisted men. He wrote about their fears, their jokes, their letters from home, their relationship with their equipment. His work, which won a Pulitzer Prize in 1944, created a powerful and enduring portrait of the American GI as a resilient, resourceful, and deeply human figure. He called them the guys that wars are won by. The name Joe was added to GI to make it even more personal and representative. G.I. Joe was the everyman. He was the farm boy from Iowa, the factory worker from Detroit, the clerk from New York. He represented the entire cross-section of American society that was called to serve. The cartoonist Bill Malden also helped to define the image of the GI with his characters Willie and Joe. These two grizzled, weary infantrymen were always dirty, cynical, and complaining about the officers, the food, and the mud. But they were also brave and loyal to each other. Malden's cartoons, which appeared in the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, were beloved by the soldiers because they were real. They showed the war from the GI's perspective. After the war, the term GI Bill was used for the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. This landmark piece of legislation provided veterans with benefits like low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans to start a business, and tuition payments for college. The name of the bill cemented the term GI in the national consciousness as a symbol of the respected veteran years. Later in 1964, the toy company Hasbro created the G.I. Joe action figure, further solidifying the name in popular culture. The term GI is a powerful example of how a word can be reclaimed. It started as a piece of bureaucratic jargon, a symbol of being an anonymous cog in a machine. But soldiers adopted it and transformed it into a symbol of their shared identity and pride. But did the universal label I, Joe, ever erase the immense diversity of the soldiers who served? Did it create a single monolithic image that overlooked the unique experiences of African American, Native American, or Japanese American soldiers? And by embracing a term that literally means government issue, were soldiers subtly reinforcing the very system that treated them like interchangeable parts? Number 13, what did you eat when you were far from home? You ate Spam, lots and lots of Spam. This canned meat product made of chopped pork, shoulder, and ham became one of the most famous and infamous parts of the soldier's diet. It was officially called luncheon meat, but everyone knew it by its brand name. The Hormel Foods Corporation had introduced Spam in 1937. Its long shelf life and lack of need for refrigeration made it an ideal military ration. The U.S. government purchased over 150 million pounds of it for the Allied troops during the war. For soldiers in the field, particularly in the Pacific Theater where fresh food was scarce, Spam was a staple. It was served for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was fried, baked, boiled, or eaten cold, straight out of the can. The GIs came up with a host of cynical nicknames for it. him that didn't pass its physical. Meatloaf without basic training and special army meat. The endless repetition of the same food led to a widespread dislike of it. Soldiers grew to loathe the sight of the distinctive blue and yellow can. Despite the complaints, Spam was a crucial part of the war effort. It provided a reliable source of protein that could be shipped anywhere in the world. It fed not only American troops, but also the armies and civilian populations of the Allied nations through the Lend-Lease program. In Britain, which was heavily rationed, Spam was a welcome addition to the diet. In the Soviet Union, it was so common that some people believed it was a traditional American dish. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs that without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army. The experience of eating Spam day after day became a shared cultural reference point for the entire generation of veterans. Joking about Spam was a way to bond over a common hardship. It was a complaint that everyone could understand. The writer and broadcaster Studs Terkel, in his oral history of the war, The Good War, collected many stories from veterans, and the topic of food, especially Spam, came up frequently. It was one of those small mundane details of life that stuck in their memories for decades. The word Spam itself took on a new life long after the war, in a way that no one could have predicted. In 1970, the British comedy troupe Monty Python aired a sketch set in a cafe where every item on the menu included Spam. As the characters try to order, a group of Vikings in the corner starts chanting "Spam, spam, spam, spam," drowning out all other conversation. This sketch, about an unwanted and inescapable product, became the inspiration for the term spam in the digital age, meaning unsolicited and unwanted email. The military ration had become a metaphor for electronic junk. The story of Spam is a story about the realities of logistics. Wars are won with supplies, and food is one of the most important. Spam was not glamorous, but it was effective. It did its job. It kept millions of people fed in the most difficult of circumstances, but how much did the monotonous and unappealing diet affect soldier morale in ways that were never officially measured? Did the constant presence of a processed canned food heighten the sense of being disconnected from the normal, fresh food world of home? And is it possible that this humble canned meat, by providing a reliable source of calories to millions, had a more significant impact on the outcome of the war than many more celebrated weapons? Number 12, how big does a bomb have to be to change the language? It had to be a blockbuster. This word entered the language to describe a new type of bomb, one so powerful that it could destroy an entire city block. The term was coined by the British press to describe the large, high-capacity bombs used by the RAF's Bomber Command. The first of these were the 4,000-pound bombs known as cookies. They were essentially huge metal cylinders packed with explosives. Their purpose was pure destruction. The word blockbuster first appeared in newspapers around 1942. And it was a dramatic and descriptive term that immediately captured the public's imagination. It combined two simple words, block and buster, to create a new one that perfectly conveyed the bomb's effect. This is a common way that new words are formed, especially in times of rapid technological change. The technology of destruction was advancing, and the language had to advance with it. The use of these bombs was part of the strategy of area bombing, which targeted entire industrial or urban areas. The theory, as promoted by figures like Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, the head of Bomber Command, was that destroying the enemy's cities, factories, and morale would shorten the war. The blockbuster bombs were a key tool in this strategy. Their massive blast wave could flatten buildings over a wide area, rip roofs off houses, and create the conditions for a firestorm when used in conjunction with smaller incendiary bombs. For the air crews who had to fly the heavy bombers like the Avro Lancaster, carrying these weapons was a source of both pride and fear. A Lancaster could carry one 4,000-pound cookie, or even larger bombs later in the war, like the 12,000-pound Tallboy or the 22,000-pound Grand Slam. These missions were incredibly dangerous. A study of Bomber Command's records shows that its air crews suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the armed forces. Nearly 56,000 of the 125,000 men who served were killed. The word blockbuster was so effective that it quickly took on a metaphorical meaning. People started to talk about a blockbuster novel or a blockbuster film. It came to mean anything that was huge, powerful, and overwhelmingly successful. This is a common path for military slang. A word is invented for a specific, often violent, purpose, and it then gets softened and absorbed into the civilian vocabulary to describe something much more benign. The military term for a massive aerial bombardment became the entertainment industry's term for a hit movie. This linguistic journey masks the word's terrifying origins. When we use the word blockbuster today to describe a summer movie, we are unconsciously echoing the language used to describe one of the most destructive conventional weapons ever created. The historian Frederick Taylor, in his book on the bombing of Dresden, details the devastating effects of the blockbuster bombs and the firestorms they created. The word in its original context was not about entertainment. It was about obliteration. But why did this particular word make the leap into popular culture so successfully? Was its dramatic, almost cartoonish sound part of its appeal? Did the use of a catchy, marketable word like blockbuster make the strategy of area bombing more palatable to the public back home? And how many people who use the word today have any idea that it began its life as a label for a weapon of mass destruction? Number 11. What do you call the danger you can't see? You call it flak. This word described the storm of metal fragments that burst from an anti-aircraft shell. For the crews of bomber planes, flak was a constant and deadly threat. It was the danger that came up from the ground. A plane could be flying perfectly one moment and be ripped apart the next by a shell fragment that no one saw coming. The word flak is a German invention. It's a shortening of the German word Fliegerwerkkanon, which literally means aviator defense cannon. Allied air crews picked up the term from their enemies, and it quickly became part of their own vocabulary. It was short, harsh sounding, and perfectly described the explosive bursts of the shells. A pilot might report flying through heavy flak, or a plane might return to base shot up by flak. The experience of flying through flak was terrifying. The shells were set with fuses to explode at a certain altitude. The explosion would create a puff of black or gray smoke and send jagged pieces of metal or shrapnel flying in all directions at high speed. A single piece of flak could sever a fuel line, disable an engine, or kill a crew member. Bomber formations had to fly a steady course on their bombing run, which made them predictable targets for the gunners on the ground. The crews could see the black puffs of smoke all around them, getting closer and closer. It was a game of chance. There was nothing they could do to avoid it, except hope it didn't hit them. The psychological toll of enduring flak was immense. The phenomenon of flak happy was the airman's equivalent of shell shock for the infantry. It described a state of extreme anxiety and nervous exhaustion caused by the constant random threat of death from the sky. The author, Joseph Heller, who is a bombardier on a B-25 in Italy, captured the absurd and terrifying nature of this experience in his classic novel, Catch-22. The book is a dark satire about the insanity of war, and the fear of flak is a constant presence. The characters are trapped in a system where the only way to get out of flying more missions is to be declared insane, but wanting to get out of flying missions is considered a sign of sanity. The word flak also made the journey from military to civilian language. Today, we use it to mean harsh criticism. A politician might take flak for a new policy, or a CEO might face flak from shareholders. This metaphorical use retains the sense of being under attack from multiple directions. Just as a bomber crew was bombarded by unseen projectiles, a public figure can be bombarded by criticism from the press and the public. This shift in meaning is another example of how the language of war is sanitized over time. The visceral life and death reality of flying through a barrage of exploding shells is transformed into the much less dangerous experience of dealing with angry emails or tough questions from reporters. The memory of the original context fades, but does our casual use of the word flak diminish the sacrifice of the air crews who faced the real thing? When we say we're getting a lot of flak at work, are we unconsciously trivializing one of the most harrowing experiences of the war? And how did the German gunners who operated the Fliegerwerkkanon feel about their work? Did they see it as a defense of their homes, or did they understand the terror they were creating in the skies above? Number 10, what is the most precious thing a soldier can get? It's a furlough. A furlough was an official leave of absence. It was a short period of time, maybe a week or two, when a soldier was allowed to leave his unit and go home, or at least to a city far away from the fighting. It was a temporary return to the normal world. For a soldier who had been living in mud, eating out of a can, and facing death every day, a furlough was a taste of paradise. The word furlough is much older than the Second World War. It comes from the Dutch word verlof, meaning permission. It has been used in military contexts for centuries, but during the war, for the millions of soldiers serving far from home, the word took on an almost magical quality. It was the thing they dreamed about, the goal that kept them going. The whole system of leave and rotation was a major logistical and administrative task for the military. The U.S. Army's point system, introduced late in the war, was a way to fairly decide who got to go home first based on their length of service, time overseas, and combat record. A furlough was a journey between two different worlds. A soldier could be in a foxhole one day, and a few days later be sitting in his mother's kitchen or taking his girlfriend to the movies. This transition could be jarring. The book and film, The Best Years of Our Lives, released in 1946, powerfully depicted the difficulties that veterans faced when they returned home. The world they had left behind had changed, and they had changed even more. A furlough was a brief preview of this difficult homecoming. The slang that surrounded furloughs was often about trying to extend them. A soldier might try to get a furlough flusher, an illness or injury, real or faked, that would get him a few extra days of leave. The desire to stay in the world of safety and comfort even for a little while longer was overwhelming. The experience of a furlough highlights the psychological split that a soldier has to endure. They have to live in two realities at once, the brutal reality of the war and the remembered reality of home. A furlough brought those two realities into sharp collision. It could be a source of great joy and renewal, but it could also be a source of deep sadness. The return to the front after a furlough was said to be one of the hardest things a soldier had to do. They had tasted peace, and now they had to go back to war. The concept of a furlough has also entered the civilian workforce, especially in recent years. It has come to mean a temporary unpaid leave of absence from a job, often due to economic hardship. This is another example of a military term being adapted for a different context. The modern use of furlough retains the idea of a temporary leave, but it has lost the original military meaning of a joyful, much anticipated escape. But what was the real impact of a furlough on a soldier's combat effectiveness? Did the brief taste of home make them fight harder to get back to it? Or did it make them more cautious and less willing to take risks? How many relationships were saved or ended during those few precious days of leave? And what was it like to be the soldier who didn't get a furlough, who had to watch his friends go home while he stayed behind? Number 9. What do you call your home in the middle of a war? You call it a foxhole. This was the soldier's most basic form of shelter. It was a hole in the ground, usually dug by the soldier himself with his entrenching tool. It was just deep enough for one or two men to crouch in for protection from bullets and shell fragments. It was a primitive, personal space in the midst of chaos. The foxhole was the symbol of the infantryman's life. The term foxhole had been used in a military context before, but it became synonymous with the experience of the ground soldier in the Second World War. It was a visceral, earthy term. It connected the soldier to the animal world, to a fox digging a burrow for safety. This was not a grand fortress or a concrete bunker. It was a hole in the dirt. It represented the most fundamental level of warfare man against the elements and the enemy, with only the ground itself for cover. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote extensively about what he called the worm's eye view of the war. He described the world as it looked from the bottom of a foxhole. He wrote about the mud, the cold, the rain, the fear, and the long hours of waiting. A foxhole wasn't just a place of protection. It was also a place of extreme boredom and discomfort. Soldiers would spend days or even weeks in these holes. They ate in them, slept in them, and fought from them. The act of digging a foxhole was the first thing a soldier did when his unit stopped. It was an instinctive act of self-preservation. Experienced soldiers knew that even a shallow depression in the ground was better than nothing. The phrase, "there are no atheists in foxholes," became popular during the war. It was first used by a military chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel William T. Cummings, during the Battle of Bataan in the Philippines in 1942. The phrase suggests that in moments of extreme danger, everyone turns to a higher power for help. The foxhole became a metaphor for any situation of intense fear and desperation. The foxhole was also a social space. A two-man foxhole created an incredibly strong bond between the two soldiers who shared it. They depended on each other completely. One would sleep while the other stood watch. They shared their food, their water, and their deepest fears. The friendships forged in foxholes were some of the most powerful of the war. This is a recurring theme in memoirs and oral histories from veterans. The man you shared a foxhole with was your brother. The term foxhole has remained in the language as a powerful metaphor. We talk about a foxhole mentality, meaning a defensive, bunker-like attitude. We speak of foxhole prayers. The word immediately evokes an image of hardship, danger, and the will to survive. But how did the endless hours spent in a hole in the ground change a person's perception of the world? Did it create a permanent sense of being under siege? What were the conversations like in those foxholes in the quiet moments between the fighting? And how many acts of quiet courage and profound friendship, unseen by any historian, took place in those simple holes in the earth? Number 8, what are the names around your neck? They are your dog tags. Every soldier was issued a pair of these small metal tags worn on a chain around the neck. They were officially called identification tags, but no soldier ever called them that. They were dog tags. The name was another piece of cynical, self-deprecating humor. It compared the soldier's identification to the license tag on a dog's collar. It was another way of saying, I'm just a piece of government property. The purpose of the dog tags was grimly practical, to identify a soldier's body if he was killed. One tag was meant to be left with the body, while the second tag was taken to notify the records office. The tags were stamped with the soldier's name, serial number, blood type, and religious preference. The blood type was a crucial piece of information for medical treatment. The religious preference, P for Protestant, C for Catholic, H for Hebrew, was to ensure that the proper burial rites could be performed. The practice of using identification tags in the U.S. military dates back to the Civil War, but they became mandatory in the First World War. The design used in the Second World War was a small rectangular tag with a notch in one end. A popular myth grew up around this notch. Soldiers believed its purpose was to be wedged between the teeth of a dead soldier to hold his mouth shut. The reality was much more mundane. The notch was there to hold the tag in place on the embossing machine that stamped the information. But the myth persisted because it was more gruesome and interesting than the truth. Dog tags became a very personal item for the soldiers. They were a constant reminder of their own mortality. Some soldiers would wrap tape around the edges of their tags to stop them from clinking together and giving away their position. The tags also became a kind of good luck charm or memento. A soldier might carry the dog tag of a fallen friend. They were a tangible link to a soldier's identity in a world that was constantly trying to erase it. The term dog tag reflects the soldier's tendency to use dark humor to cope with the realities of their situation. By using a term that was slightly insulting, they were taking control of it. It was a way of acknowledging the grim purpose of the tags without being overwhelmed by it. It was a small act of defiance against the impersonal nature of the military machine. After the war, dog tags became a symbol of military service. Veterans would often keep their tags for the rest of their lives. In later years, dog tags even became a fashion accessory, completely divorced from their original serious purpose. This is the final stage in the life of a piece of slang when it is so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that its origin is almost forgotten. But what did it feel like for a young man to be handed these two small pieces of metal, knowing their primary purpose was for the identification of his own corpse? How many soldiers in a quiet moment held their dog tags in their hand and contemplated their own fate? And what stories could those millions of small metal tags tell if they could speak? Number 7, what do you call a soldier who is gone? He's a wool. This is another military acronym that has become a common English word. It stands for absent without leave. It meant A soldier had left his post or his unit without official permission. It was a serious offense, but it was different from desertion. Desertion meant you left with no intention of ever coming back. A wall was a more temporary state. A soldier might go AWOL for a few days to see a girlfriend, deal with a family emergency, or just to escape the pressures of military life for a little while. The term AWOL has been used by the U.S. military since the 19th century, but it became extremely common during the Second World War. With millions of men under arms, many of them citizen soldiers who were not accustomed to the strict discipline of military life, going AWOL was a frequent problem for commanders. The military police, or MPs, spent a lot of their time tracking down soldiers who had gone AWOL. The reasons for going AWOL were varied. Sometimes it was for romance. The phrase, "a wolf on the prowl is a GI on the go," was a popular joke. But often, the reasons were more serious. A soldier might receive a distressing letter from home and feel he had to go back to sort things out. Or, a soldier might be suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and simply be unable to face another day of his duties. The military treated AWOL as a serious disciplinary issue. The punishment could range from a loss of pay to time in the stockade or military prison. But there was often an unspoken understanding that a soldier who went AWOL for a short time and then returned was not the same as a deserter who had betrayed his comrades. The author James Jones, in his novel From Here to Eternity, which is set in the U.S. Army in Hawaii just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, explores the complex culture of the enlisted man, including the reasons why a soldier might go AWOL. The word AWOL has been fully absorbed into civilian English. We use it to describe anyone who is not where they are supposed to be. A student might be AWOL from class, or a coworker might be AWOL from a meeting. The meaning has been broadened and softened. In its civilian use, AWOL is often a bit playful. In its original military context, it was no joke. The phenomenon of soldiers going AWOL raises questions about the psychological cost of war. It shows that even in a highly disciplined and patriotic army, there is a limit to what a person can endure. The act of going AWOL was often a desperate attempt to reclaim some control over one's own life. But how many soldiers who were listed as AWOL were actually suffering from severe combat stress and were in need of medical help, not punishment? Did the strict military justice system fail to understand the deep psychological wounds that could lead a good soldier to walk away from his post? And what does the very existence of a term like AWOL tell us about the fundamental tension between the needs of the individual and the demands of the military machine? Number 6, where does the latest news come from? It comes from the latrine rumor. The latrine, the military term for a toilet, was one of the few places where soldiers from different units could gather and talk informally. It was the military equivalent of the office water cooler, and it was the place where rumors were born and spread. A latrine rumor was a piece of information that was unofficial, unconfirmed, and very often untrue. The military is a world of secrets and hierarchies. Information is carefully controlled and passed down through the chain of command. For the average soldier at the bottom of the pyramid, there was a constant hunger for information. Where are we going next? When are we going home? Is the food going to get any better? In the absence of official news, rumors rushed in to fill the void. The latrine was the perfect breeding ground for these stories. The term latrine rumor was a way of labeling this kind of information. By calling it a latrine rumor, a soldier was acknowledging that the source was unreliable. It was a way of saying, I heard this, but don't bet your life on it. The military even had an official term for this phenomenon, the rumor mill. They understood that rumors could be dangerous to morale. If a rumor spread that a unit was being sent into a particularly dangerous battle, it could cause widespread fear and anxiety. The military newspaper Stars and Stripes would sometimes run articles debunking the most common latrine rumors. The psychologist Gordon Allport, in his 1947 book, The Psychology of Rumor, studied how rumors work. He found that they thrive in situations where there is both ambiguity and importance. For the soldiers, the future was both critically important and completely ambiguous, making it the perfect environment for rumors to flourish. A latrine rumor was a way of trying to create certainty in an uncertain world. Even a false piece of information can be more comforting than no information at all. The term shows the importance of informal social networks in a large organization. The official channels of communication are only one part of the story. The real information, or at least the most interesting information, often travels through unofficial paths. The latrine rumor was the GI's version of the grapevine. This phenomenon is not unique to the military. Every large office, every school, every community has its own version of the latrine rumor. We call it gossip or the rumor mill. It's a fundamental part of how human beings communicate. But in the high stakes environment of a war, the rumors took on a life or death significance. But what if some of the wildest latrine rumors actually turned out to be true? How many times did a piece of vital information leak out and spread through the ranks before it was officially announced? Did the commanders ever deliberately start a latrine rumor as a way to spread disinformation or to test the morale of their troops? And in the age of the internet and instant communication, have we all just moved our latrine rumors online? Number 5, how do you express your approval? You say, hubba hubba. This enthusiastic phrase was the GI's way of showing strong approval, usually for an attractive woman. It was the sound of a wolf whistle turned into a phrase. It was shouted out, often by groups of soldiers, when a pin-up girl appeared on a movie screen, or when a pretty local woman walked by. The origin of hubba hubba is a mystery which is common for slang terms that emerge from spoken language. One theory is that it comes from the Chinese phrase, hao bu hao, which means, is it good? And sounds a bit like hubba hubba. American soldiers stationed in China might have picked it up and started using it. Another theory connects it to the military cadence, hop, 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 used in drilling, changed slightly to sound more exciting. A third theory suggests it's a variation of the German word Liebe, meaning love. Whatever its origin, it exploded in popularity among American servicemen during the war. Hubba hubba was a cry of youthful energy and longing. These were young men, far from home and in a world that was overwhelmingly male. The phrase was a way to express their appreciation for the world of women that they had left behind and that they hoped to return to. It was a bit crude, perhaps, but it was generally meant with a sense of good-natured enthusiasm rather than malice. The phrase was so popular that it became a national catchphrase. It was used in movies, in songs, and in advertisements. Bob Hope, the comedian, who famously entertained the troops on USO tours all over the world, helped to popularize the phrase. His shows were a link to home, and the slang he used was the slang of the soldiers themselves. When Bob Hope said hubba hubba, it was a sign that he was one of them. The use of hubba hubba reflects the culture of the 1940s. It was a time before the social changes of the later 20th century. The phrase shows a certain attitude about the relationship between men and women that would be seen very differently today. It's a reminder of how much social norms can change in a few generations. After the war, the phrase quickly started to sound dated. It was so strongly associated with the war generation that it didn't really carry over to their children. It remains a piece of linguistic history, a soundbite from a very specific time and place, but what did the women who were the object of the hubba hubba calls think about it? Did they see it as a harmless compliment or as an annoying form of harassment? Did the phrase serve as a release valve for the sexual tensions that were an inevitable part of sending millions of young men overseas? And what does the rapid rise and fall of a catchphrase like this tell us about the fast-moving nature of popular culture? Number 4, what do you call a sudden, overwhelming attack? You call it a blitz. This word, which means lightning in German, became the English term for a new and terrifying type of warfare. The German military strategy at the beginning of the war was the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This involved using a concentrated force of tanks, planes, and infantry to break through the enemy's lines and cause a rapid collapse. The term was first used by the Western press to describe the German invasion of Poland in 1939. For the British, the word blitz took on a very specific and personal meaning. From September 1940 to May 1941, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched a sustained bombing campaign against British cities, especially London. This period became known simply as the Blitz. It was a time of nightly air raids, of sirens, of buildings collapsing, and of people sleeping in subway stations, or tubes, for shelter. Though the word blitz perfectly captured the speed and intensity of the attacks, it was a short, sharp, violent-sounding word. It became part of the everyday language of the British people. They talked about the blitz spirit, a feeling of national unity and defiance in the face of the bombing. The journalist and broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, reporting from London for the American radio network CBS, brought the sounds and the feel of the Blitz into the homes of millions of Americans. His famous opening line, "This is London," followed by a description of the air raids, helped to shape American public opinion about the war. The word blitz was so powerful that it has remained in the English language with a number of different meanings. In American football, etchi meldus is a defensive play where a large number of players rush the quarterback. We talk about a media blitz or an advertising blitz to describe a sudden, intense campaign. We can even have a blitz of cleaning to get the house ready for visitors. In all these uses, the word retains its original sense of speed, concentration, and overwhelming force. The story of the word blitz is a story of how a foreign word can be adopted into English to describe a new reality. There was no existing English word that quite captured the feeling of this new type of warfare. Blitz filled the gap. It's a reminder that language is always changing and adapting, often borrowing words from other languages to meet new needs. But how did the adoption of a German word to describe the German attacks affect the psychology of the people under bombardment? Did using the enemy's own word for lightning give them a sense of control over it? Did the term blitz spirit accurately reflect the mood of the country, or was it a piece of propaganda that masked the very real fear and suffering that people were enduring? And why has this word, born from such a violent context, become so commonplace in sports and marketing? Number 3, what is the sound of the guns in the sky? Here, the sound of ack-ack. This was the universal slang term for anti-aircraft fire. It referred to both the guns themselves and the shells they fired. The term originated in the First World War with the British Army. It came from the signalese or radio telephony spelling alphabet used at the time. A was hack, and C was Charlie. The abbreviation for anti-aircraft was AA, which was spoken as hack-ack. The name was so catchy and descriptive that it stuck. During the Second World War, ack-ack batteries were a common sight in cities, around important factories, and near military bases. They were the first line of defense against enemy air raids. For civilians on the ground, the sound of the ack-ack guns firing was a comforting one. It meant that someone was fighting back. The sight of the searchlights crisscrossing the night sky, followed by the roar of the guns and the flashes of the exploding shells, was a dramatic and terrifying spectacle. For the air crews, of course, ack-ack was another name for flak. It was a deadly threat. But the term ack-ack was used more by the people on the ground, the gunners and the civilians, while flak was the term used by the flyers. This shows how different groups of people can have different words for the same thing depending on their perspective. You know, if it's coming from your gun, it's ack-ack. If it's coming at your plane, it's flak. The men and women who served in the ack-ack units like Britain's anti-aircraft command were often seen as less glamorous than the fighter pilots. But their job was vital. The constant barrage of fire from the ground forced enemy bombers to fly higher and faster, which made their bombing less accurate. A direct hit on a plane was rare, but the cumulative effect of the ack-ack defenses was significant. A study of the Blitz conducted by the British government showed that the psychological effect of the ack-ack on enemy air crews was also a major factor. It was stressful and dangerous to fly through it. The term ack-ack is a great example of military jargon. It's functional, it's short, and it has a clear origin in a specific military practice. Unlike some slang, its history is not in doubt. It's a word that was born out of a technical need and became a common name. After the war, the term mostly faded from common use, except in historical contexts. The technology of air defense moved on. Surface-to-air missiles replaced most of the big guns. The sound of ack-ack is no longer a part of our world. It remains a word from a specific era, a sound from a past war. But what was it like to be an ack-ack gunner, standing by your weapon night after night, searching the dark sky for an enemy you could barely see. How did they deal with the knowledge that their work, while defensive, was still about trying to send a plane full of men crashing to the earth? And does the fact that we had two different words, hack, ack, and flak, for the same explosions, tell us something important about how our perspective shapes the language we use to describe reality? Number two, what is a wound from a bomb? It's shrapnel. This word is often used to describe any metal fragment from an exploding bomb or shell. But its original meaning was much more specific, and its story comes from a British artillery officer named Henry Shrapnel. In the late 18th century, he invented a new type of artillery shell. It was a hollow cannonball filled with musket balls and a small explosive charge. A fuse was set to make the shell explode in the air over the heads of enemy troops. The explosion would scatter the musket balls over a wide area like a giant shotgun blast. This shrapnel shell was devastatingly effective. By the time of the First World War, the design of artillery shells had changed. The new, high-explosive shells didn't contain round balls. They were designed to shatter their own metal casing into thousands of jagged, high-velocity fragments. Technically, these fragments were not shrapnel in the original sense, but the name was so well known that soldiers started using the word shrapnel to refer to these fragments as well. The old meaning was lost, and the new, broader meaning took over. In the Second World War, shrapnel was one of the greatest dangers to the infantry soldier. A wound from a piece of shrapnel was a common injury. These fragments could be tiny, almost invisible, or large, jagged chunks of metal. They traveled at incredible speeds and could cause terrible damage. Medics and surgeons developed new techniques to deal with these kind of wounds. The development of penicillin, which became widely available during the war, was a lifesaver. It could prevent the infections that were often the real killer after a shrapnel wound. The word shrapnel is a cold, technical-sounding word for something that causes so much pain and suffering. It's a clinical term. A soldier wouldn't say, "I was hit by a piece of an exploding bomb." He would say, "I got a piece of shrapnel." This is another example of how language can be used to distance oneself from a traumatic event. The technical term is easier to say and to hear than a graphic description of the injury. The story of the word shrapnel is a story of how language evolves. A word that started as a proper name, the name of an inventor, became the name of his invention. Then, as the technology changed, the meaning of the word shifted to cover the new technology. This is a process called generalization. The word lost its specific meaning and took on a much broader one. Today, almost no one remembers Henry Shrapnel or his original shell design. But his name lives on in the word we use to describe the deadly fragments of an explosion. But how many soldiers who used the word shrapnel knew they were talking about a man named Henry? Does it matter that the technical meaning of the word has been lost, as long as everyone understands what it means in a modern context? And what does it say about our relationship with technology that we so often name our inventions, even our most deadly ones, after the people who created them? Number one, what do you call a new soldier? You call him a rookie, or a trainee, or a replacement. He was the new guy, the one who had just arrived at the front with his clean uniform and his naive ideas about what war was really like. The relationship between the new soldiers and the combat veterans was a complex one. The word rookie is older than the war. It's thought to be a corruption of the word recruit. It had been used in sports, especially baseball, since the late 19th century to describe a first-year player. The military adopted the term, and it fit perfectly. A rookie was inexperienced. He didn't know the ropes. He was more likely to make a dangerous mistake. The veterans had to teach him how to survive. The process of turning a rookie into a seasoned soldier was the central drama of the infantry unit. The veterans, men like Bill Mauldin's characters, Willie and Joe, were cynical and war-weary. They had seen it all. They looked at the rookies with a mixture of pity, annoyance, and a sense of responsibility. They knew that many of these fresh-faced young men would not survive their first few weeks of combat. A 1947 study by the U.S. Army, Combat Exhaustion, found that the casualty rates for new replacements were significantly higher than for experienced soldiers. The rookie's arrival was a constant reminder of the losses the unit had suffered. He was there to replace a friend who had been killed or wounded. This could create resentment. The veterans might be reluctant to get to know the new guy, to learn his name. It was a way of protecting themselves emotionally. If you didn't get close to him, it wouldn't hurt as much when he was gone. But at the same time, they had to train him. Their own survival depended on the rookie learning quickly and not doing something stupid. The term rookie itself is not harsh. It's almost gentle. It's a word of experience, not of contempt. It simply states a fact: you are new here. It was part of the process of initiation. To survive was to cease to be a rookie. It was to earn the right to be called a veteran. The experience of the rookie highlights the brutal learning curve of combat. The lessons were taught in the hardest way possible. The rookie had to learn the difference between the sounds of incoming and outgoing shells. He had to learn not to bunch up, to always be aware of his surroundings, to trust the instincts of the old-timers. The war was a constant process of education, and the tuition was paid in blood. The word rookie has remained a common part of our language, especially in sports and in the workplace. It still means the new person, the one who is learning the job, but its use in the military context carries a weight that the civilian use does not. In the civilian world, a rookie's mistake might be embarrassing. In a war, a rookie's mistake could be fatal. But what was the single most important lesson a veteran could teach a rookie? Was it a piece of technical knowledge, or was it an attitude, a way of thinking about survival? How long did it take for a rookie to either die or become a veteran? And what does the enduring presence of a word like rookie in our culture tell us about our fascination with the process of initiation, of a newcomer being tested and transformed by a difficult experience?